All right, thanks
There you go.
everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you, Susan, for also joining me as well as the other people here on this kind of call. I want to say it's a phone call, but it's not. It's our on video chat type thing.
It's our video chat. Yeah.
Yay! We can see everybody, which is nice. But as we were saying before, so anybody new that just joined, if you have a question for Susan, please feel free to enter that into the chat feature. And we will answer that as we go along. But first and foremost, why don't we start with Susan, since we're talking with you the whole night. But why don't we have you start out with describing your background in working with the library system, as well as some leadership roles that you have held in the past.
Okay. Well, thanks. And hi, everybody. And feel free to pop in questions because we want to try to get your questions answered. I don't want to be talking the whole time. And some of my students may have heard this, but I'll give you a quick rundown of what I've done. And I think I've been really fortunate in having, a super career. I was one of those folks who kind of knew early on that I wanted to be a librarian. And when I was making career decisions, believe it or not, there were not a lot of women in law or medicine. It was kind of teaching, nursing, and those things weren't that attractive to me. So I thought, all right, I'll try this library thing. So I knew from early on, and I always worked in public libraries or organizations related to public libraries. And now I think about it, my first job was a branch manager in a small library system, in a public library system in New Jersey. And man, that was a shock. I was the youngest person there, and I was in charge. And everybody else who worked there was older than I was, and they were all ladies. So it was it was a great experience, and I really learned to listen to them and before I made any changes. But I felt like I had a good training in my master's program in terms of library kinds of things, but I didn't have a lot of management training. So while I was doing this job, I got a master's in business administration, which is not necessarily what everybody has to do, but for me, at the time, it worked for me. And there wasn't even then, I don't think there was a master's in public administration, which I would really strongly recommend for folks if they wanted to do that kind of thing. But I moved along in my career, and then I moved to California in 1980, and I worked in a number of different positions in California. Ultimately, I guess my first leadership position, although I was in fairly responsible positions, but I wanted to be like a director of a library. That was something I wanted to do. So I became a director of a very small library system. It's one library in one little town, and I was the only librarian there. Plus, I was the director, but I also was the only librarian. So I'm going to try to turn this thing off. Mute. Okay. I think that did it. I don't know. No, I don't want to do that. I want you to hear me. I'm sorry if you hear little noises. Anyway, sorry. So anyway, then I had this job as this is something interesting. So I was a director, but it was a very small library. And finally, when, I don't know if we got we did finally get another librarian while I was there. But then something that I did, and I wanted to mention this to folks, was that on the next job I had, I was in that job for 5 years or so. And the next job I had, I took a job as an assistant director of a larger library system. So some people said to me like, well, you were a director and then you go be an assistant director. Well, I wanted to be an assistant director because I knew in this organization, it was a much larger organization. So I would get a different kind of experience. And I also knew the director was going to be retiring. Wink, wink, nod, nod. So I thought, maybe I'd have a chance to get the job, which ultimately I did. Again, another thing I did was after I was a county librarian at that time, which was an awesome job. It was one of the best jobs I ever had because it wasn't too huge, but you could get a lot of stuff done. But then I had another chance to get another job at a much larger library system. And I went kind of from being the county librarian, I went down a couple rungs. I wasn't even the assistant. I was like lower than the assistant. I was a deputy. And a lot of people said, oh, why are you doing that? And I knew if I did that, I would get experience at a scale that I just hadn't had before. So the point of all this is you got to look at everything really carefully as you move through your career to decide, what do you really getting out of these various jobs. So, ultimately one of the best positions I had, and I'm very proud of a position where I was the city librarian of San Francisco, but I didn't just fall into that. I didn't become the city librarian right away. I was hired initially as the deputy city librarian, and in that situation, I was the second in command of the San Francisco Public Library, which was a huge job. And unfortunately, the city librarian, my boss, had a very unexpected stroke, and she became ill and never came back to work. So I had to step up and take over. And because of many different political and other kind of vagaries, I wasn't made the permanent director for probably, a year or so. And that was really challenging. I didn't want to hire somebody in my job because who knows what was going to happen. I wanted to have a job to go back to. So I struggled for a long time trying to keep that going, but eventually I got appointed there. And from that job, I was really fortunate. I was able to become the state librarian of California, and that's a whole story about how you get to do something like that. It's a gubernatorial appointment. But the great thing about that job was that I really got to make a difference on a statewide scale. And there's lots of challenges when you're working in an organization like that, but you can really see yourself making a difference. And then I went on to become the city librarian here in Seattle, which was awesome. It was a great experience. Yet that was kind of interrupted when I was asked by President Obama to run a federal agency in Washington, D.C. And that was a really unique experience too. And then here I am back in Seattle at the I School, which is great, helping students think about their future. So I've worked at different levels, and each of the levels has its own pros and cons, but it's really good to be able to see what happens at different levels too. I think it makes a big difference in terms of how you can affect change. So you got to really be strategic and also think carefully about what you want to do and what you're going to learn from the different positions you might be thinking about.
Wow, what a long history.
Right, that was so long, too long. Sorry.
No, that was great. No, it's just I don't normally get to talk with people with that extensive of a history background, so it's really nice to be able to hear from somebody who's kind of almost done it all, if you will. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. I was kind of curious as far as how long you stayed in each role, how much length of time you would put in there, because I know right now we're moving into this kind of career field where a lot of people aren't staying in positions very long, or they, kind of different from I'm going to be in the same job for 35 years type of mentality from before. So I was just kind of wondering, was there a natural progression to the movement, or?
Well, that's a really good question, because some people might say, oh, she's always hopping around, but I made the difference wherever I was. But, I stayed, for instance, in San Francisco, I was there for 6 years. Most places I would say I worked maybe 4 to 6 years. Not everywhere, but that's, I think if you're in an organization for 4 to 5 years, you really get to know the organization. You can have an impact on it, make some change, and then hopefully maybe move on to another challenge. The other thing is if you're in a situation where you are in the same organization for a number of years, if the organization isn't too small, you can take advantage and do different jobs. I think the important thing is trying to experience different kinds of work, even if you, for personal reasons or whatever, are in the same place. But, you really want to be able to get to know a job and try to make a difference and help your team if you have a project or something. And for the most part, I think around 4 to 5 years is a good period of time. And you could certainly stay longer, but I think that gives you a chance to make a difference. And sometimes you're at a point where, new leadership coming in or new team members can really make a difference, and it's time for you to try something else.
Great, that's very helpful. So moving on to our next question, we're going to go broader now, so kind of away from your personal story and more into thinking about the LIS field in general. So I'm curious if you can tell me why you think leadership is an important skill for professionals in the LIS field.
Well, I think it's important. And well, first of all, you can be a leader at many different levels. So when we say leader, we don't necessarily just mean like the boss or a director. You can be a leader of your unit, a team leader. So the ability to try to move forward and be a leader, you can achieve that in at a lot of different levels. But I think it's important because here we are in this time of great change in how information is delivered, change in our communities, change in our social priorities. It feels like the whole world, particularly the United States, is kind of changing all the time. So in order to make sure our institutions, our libraries, no matter what kind of library you want to work in, or an information center, if it's a private organization, you want to try to determine how you can remain relevant in a time of great change. And I think that focus on institutional relevance is best at least led or initiated that work by a leader. And that it doesn't mean that you won't have a team working with you or you won't bring people along, but you have to have a vision, I think, to see where it's most appropriate for you and the institution to go. And it's not necessarily, there's not one answer. It's all about your institution and your community, from a small branch library to a big academic library. It's all about what does your unique community need, and you as a leader need to be able to go out and recognize that, figure that out, do the best you can to find out what those needs of your particular audience are and do the best you can to meet them. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of energy, and also takes the ability to go outside of yourself. You can't assume, you can't be comfortable. You shouldn't be comfortable. You should always be looking for, kind of the next opportunity, the next partnership, the next service you need to be providing.
Right. Absolutely. So you kind of talked about this a little bit in your answer. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more and expand and talk about what the biggest challenge facing leaders today, being that, it can be something large or something just specific to where you're working. So
that's a really good question, because I guess I'd say two things. And I addressed it a little bit before, but how do you really understand how your institution can serve the audiences, the primary audiences that you need to serve? And that can be really challenging, particularly in a public library setting where for many years maybe you've been all things to all people. And if you don't have the resources or time to do that, sometimes you have to be very strategic and step back and say, for my resources and my capacity, where can I make the biggest impact? And that can be hard, because sometimes you have to give things up in order to have a big impact. And giving things up that some people are used to having or expect to have can really be hard in challenging in an organization, also in a community. So you have workers, staff who are invested in a certain way of doing things. Community has certain expectations, but really to be impactful in the 21st century, you have to really look at some of that and see, what do I want to really invest in, and what do I have to maybe leave behind a little bit. The other thing, I think a big challenge facing leaders is, and facing everybody, not just leaders, is that many people haven't even been in a library or whatever kind of library for a number of years. I mean, my background has primarily been public, so I speak from that, really from the heart. But But people haven't been in libraries. So what they remember is what happened to them in junior high or high school or college, or some experience where they didn't pay their fines and they got in trouble or whatever it is. They have a very kind of 20th century nostalgia, sometimes negative point of view about what a library can be. So I think it's critical for a leader to be able to convey to the public, particularly the public that don't necessarily understand how many things we're doing, and the outreach and the community engagement, workforce development and literacy, all those things that we're doing. Many people just don't even think about that. They don't think about that in relation to a 21st century library. So how can you, so I think it's very important for leaders to be able to develop a fairly crisp and clear message that they can share with particularly non-users to help them understand what the importance of the library. Now, there's some folks who are going to get their information from, not necessarily from the library, from other means, but it's important for them to understand why the institution is a value in their community, even if they don't use it all the time. And so we really have to try to bring them into the 21st century and realize that, it's not the shushing quiet place anymore. In fact, that's often a problem because some people want it to be quiet and they get upset when there's too many active programs or teams or whatever. But it's a whole new place, and I think we have to be able to try to share that positive vision with people, and that's challenging. You have to be able to communicate. It's interesting. Some people have said to me, I try to reflect sometimes on myself and what I do, but I've had a number of people say to me that I have the capacity to explain things to people who aren't familiar with the lingo or anything like that of the library world, and I can tell the library story so people understand it and engage and can engage with it. So that's I'm proud that I can do that. I don't know, I honestly think I've just kind of gained that skill over the years. You can't necessarily go to school to get that. I know when I worked in San Francisco, there was a lot of media attention to what we were doing all the time. So I got a huge amount of experience in dealing with the media, much more so than I would say most library directors want to have or need to have. But, it was kind of like a trial by fire there. So
do you think you've gained that experience because you've been in some of these more director, assistant director, deputy type roles?
I think you're right about that, because I've been in roles for a while now where you are expected to be able to communicate effectively. And, but I shouldn't say that though, because when we think about how we are engaging with our communities, every worker in the library is a knowledge worker. Every worker can tell the library story. So it's not just the director. Sometimes the director has to deal with the media or with, big donors or something like that. But we all have to be able to tell the story of our value to everybody who comes in the door or everybody we meet in the grocery store.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think my personal experience working as a library assistant, so not even a full librarian, of course, because I don't have an LIS, but I definitely had to do that for other people as they would come in and ask questions and all that. So I think that's definitely an important skill. Absolutely. So next question I have for you is, how have you seen leadership enacted in the workplace? So we've talked a lot about your personal leadership skills, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see it play out for your colleagues or the people that might be working for you. How is that leadership shown from everybody in all parts of the library?
So, I think a lot of that depends on personal style, but I feel very strongly that leadership in the workplace for it to be successful, the individual, whoever's serving in that leadership capacity in whatever way, they have to be authentic. You have to be able to look at that person and understand what they're saying, and be able to talk to them and ask questions. I mean, that is absolutely critical. And the individual who's in the leadership role has to be willing to listen. So this is really critical. They, I mean, they're going to be nowhere if they're just barking out orders all the time. They're going to get nowhere. They have to listen, and listen carefully, and consider information that they receive. And what I found, particularly in situations where maybe you're leading a project or you're developing a new service or something like that, people are going to have different points of view about what you're trying to do. But the most important thing is that you gather as much information as you can about the project or the service or whatever it is. You listen to everybody, you consider the information, and then with your team, you decide how to move forward. So when you decide how to move forward, there's going to be things that some people like, things that some people don't like, but I think it's absolutely critical to be able to be transparent and talk to people about why you are or aren't doing something they suggested. Because I have consistently seen in my career that if people provide input and you never acknowledge that, and you go ahead and maybe you're taking a different direction than they had suggested, that's really problematic. If you take the time to explain why you made a certain decision, a policy, service, whatever it is, they may not agree with it, but at least they will, I think, understand that you took the time to try to make sure they understood the context or whatever your motivation was in moving forward. So I think that's really critical. And I was thinking when I looked at that question, it's kind of like, you hear people say, walk the walk. So, I mean, you really have to, if you say you're going to do something or support something, you got to do it. You can't send somebody else out to do it. You can't, just kind of not be authentic about it. You gotta do the job. And in order to, you have to be willing to work, and you also have to be kind of a combination of humility. And when I say humility, I mean, I've seen people who are very, what do I want to say? They think so highly of themselves in a leadership position. They think they're so special that they don't have time, or they can't relate very well to everybody on all levels. So when I say walk the walk, I mean every single person in an organization is important. They all have a job to do. You should care about all of them. Everybody has their own value, and a true leader can recognize that and help people understand that you do care about what they're doing, and you're not just hobnobbing with all the higher ups. Mm-hmm. So, that's just a personal style, but I feel strongly about that.
I very much agree with that too. So I appreciate you sharing that. And just a quick reminder, everybody on the call, we are taking questions via the chat feature. So if you are able to and have a question come up, please feel free to use that feature so we can slip those questions in, and I don't have to be the only person asking. So moving along, you touched a little bit on this, I think, before as well. So it's kind of nice that they're all synergistic, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the difference between management and leadership, because people end up in management positions, and then I think there are also people that are leaders but don't necessarily manage, and there are people that manage but aren't leaders as well. So I'd be curious to hear more.
Well, I think that's a really important differentiation to make. And in fact, we talked about that. We talk a little bit about that in our in the organization, the management of information centers, the organization course I'm teaching. And I also got a really great Harvard Business Review article about that that someone just forwarded to me. So what's really the difference? Well, a leader, again, here I'm going to talk about communication, but a leader has a vision, is able to communicate that vision and bring his team, his or her team, or the organization along, so they can present a compelling vision. And that vision is built on, knowing the skills of the organization, the capacity, the resources, the audiences. I mean, there are many, many factors that go into developing that vision, but they have the strategic view to be able to develop a vision. So, and in some cases, leaders also are managers. I mean, it's great if you can get a leader who also is a manager, because then they kind of understand how to get things done. But let's say the organization is absolutely huge and the leader is the visionary. So the manager is the person who implements the leader's vision. And that's really important. It's really, really important. It's funny. I'm thinking of a situation where I knew someone who was serving as a director of a large library system, and the person was a visionary. The person had a very strong kind of vision and sense of where the institution needed to go, but was not able to implement the vision. And the weakness of this person was this person did not see that they needed a manager. And I've seen that before, where leaders who are visionaries are not able to maybe like share the power or delegate responsibility or power to someone else who can really come in there and get it done. So in fact, another characteristic that we didn't talk about of a leader is being able to figure out, okay, what are my strengths and where do I need someone to help complement me so I can get things done. So a manager is critical, very effective, making things happen, kind of the go-to kind of person, but not necessarily setting the vision. It's really the person who carries out the vision. To me, that's a big difference. That's the key difference.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. And I'd be curious to see your Harvard Business Review journal or article as well.
Yeah,
so
I'll send it to you. In fact, it's interesting because this quarter, I have someone who's working with me as a reader grader who took an organizational management course through the MSIM program. And so she has some really interesting readings that she's sharing with me that they used in the MSIM program. A little more business oriented than where we are necessarily in the MLIS program. It's still really, really good and really clear delineations, because sometimes it's hard to delineate between what's a leader, what's a manager, particularly if you're in a small organization where you're all working as a team, and it's sometimes very transparent, you don't really see the differences. But it's one of those situations where it's like, you hear people say, well, I'll know it when I see it. So you'll probably know it when you see a leader and then someone who's serving as a manager. But as I said, I hadn't really thought about it till I was going back in my mind over this example. But a leader, a key characteristic of a leader is the ability to self-reflect and see what they need to be able to achieve their vision. I mean, for me, a good example is that, I came into the field many, many, many years ago when we were still using catalog cards. It was a long time ago. So I have kind of, just learned my way through IT. I've never had a lot of training or anything like that. I've kind of made do of what I have to know to get by. But I know in organizations where I've worked, I need to have a strong IT person working with me. I mean, I might have a vision, but I need a person with a strong technical background that I trust. So anyway, you just have to self-reflect and know what are your strengths or what are some of your weaknesses or your areas where you don't have the skills that you need to bolster your skills for your organization to be successful.
Mm-hmm. You kind of touched my next question, which was wondering what one characteristic was that you think every leader should possess. Is there anything else you'd like to expand?
I was talking about humility and authenticity. Mm-hmm. Those are my buzzwords. But the other thing is, they have to have a sense of humor. They have to be like a normal person. I mean, that doesn't sound right, and this is recorded, of course, but they have to be, what is it? Oh, so we were talking in our class just recently about IQ and EQ. Mm-hmm. So IQ, you're really smart, you're really maybe technically proficient, but if you don't have emotional intelligence, that ability to empathize with people, to be able to bring people together, to be able to talk to people, that emotional intelligence is very, very important. And also just being able to be self-reflective. Oh, another one is, being able to admit when you make mistakes. Now, this is something I think that a lot of people in leadership positions don't do, because they think, it's going to make me look weak or something like that. It's funny, when I was in California, when I was the state librarian, I was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger. Now, I didn't, I certainly didn't have I saw him maybe 3 or 4 times while I was in my job. I didn't have weekly meetings with Governor Schwarzenegger or anything like that. But he did appoint me, and we did have an interview before I got the job. But the thing about Governor Schwarzenegger was, he was not your traditional politician. He was very much of a moderate guy. But what I saw with him that really struck me was he was willing to admit when he made mistakes and course correct. And I think that's because he didn't have as much maybe invested in the whole political thing as maybe career politicians. But he was, and a lot of people said, oh, Schwarzenegger, blah, blah, how can he do it? He did a pretty good job, and he listened to people around him, and when he went off course, he would admit it and change course. So that's a critical characteristic. And the other characteristic, I think that sometimes it takes a while to develop it, but how do I want to say this? I want to say self-confidence, but that's not exactly what it is. It's more like a sense of yourself. So, for instance, when I was saying, some leaders don't want to admit they've made decisions because they think it's going to reflect badly on them. Well, no. If you have a solid sense of yourself and you're not feeling like you have to prove yourself all the time, if you make a mistake, or if something goes a certain way and it's not the best way, I mean, you're better off saying, hey, this isn't working, we got to modify this, as opposed to being so worried kind of about your own, what people are going to think about you. And that's hard. That can be really hard. Because, when you're, well, here's another characteristic, and then I'll stop talking for this question. But, if you're a person who wants to be liked by everybody, then the leader-manager thing, that's pretty tough. Because, you have to be willing to accept that you're not going to be liked by everybody. Now, hopefully you might be respected by everybody, but you're not going to make everybody happy, and you have to be able to accept that, because you're doing what you're doing for the best of your library or your organization or your business, and you're just not going to make everybody happy all the time. You just can't. And sometimes that's very hard for people to live with. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to. Doesn't mean you're a bad person.
Right.
It's not a popularity contest.
Yeah, I think when I think back about leaders that I have really enjoyed in my life, they've definitely been the people to make those hard decisions, and they've also done it in a way that has not necessarily been, I wouldn't call it harsh, but I would say that they have done it in a way that tried to do as much mitigating of problems as they could, but they also stood by their decision. Right. And justified it, and knew that they weren't going to make everybody happy, and they were okay with that. And I sometimes think that is some of the difficult parts about being a leader, is that you just know that you're never going to make everybody happy. That's just
that's tough. It is tough.
Absolutely. So kind of, you've touched on all of this. I love it. You've been so good at touching everything that I was curious about. But I'm wondering if you have any specific advice for new professionals. So basically anybody here on the video chat, just wonder if you have advice for them as they think about learning and growing into a leader, hopefully at some point in the library system.
Well, our students, I'm really impressed with our students at the iSchool because they are so, many of them are working and so they're balancing work and school. Others who may not be working are doing internships and directed field work and volunteering for the school, for some of our student associations and organizations. People are people are very, very engaged, and that's very exciting for me to see, because I think, you want to try to take advantage of the many opportunities you might have. If you're in a job serving as a team lead, if you get to do that for a certain project or a service, if you get a chance to take on a different role, cross-training or filling in for someone while they're away, something like that. The other thing that I'd encourage is thinking about professional development opportunities. So at the iSchool, we have the American Library Association chapter, and we have all kinds of opportunities at the iSchool. But as you get your first job, think about what you're willing to do to balance your personal life and your professional life. But when I started out my career, I got involved in my state association in the new members chapter, and I really got a lot of great experience in there. And then and that was in New Jersey. And then when I moved to California, I spent most of my time involved in my state library association. Now, not everybody wants to do that, but there are various professional associations that would help you learn and grow. I would encourage you to think about getting involved in that. And if you're not able to take the time away to go to national conferences or anything like that, there are regional and state groups that you can get involved with. I think that's really critical. And the other thing I would say in terms of learning and growing is, as I said earlier, if you have the capability, or if you have the latitude to either move, live in different locations. I know not everybody has that, but working in different systems, I think, really helps you develop your leadership skills. Now, having said that, I also would encourage you to take different jobs if you're tied in one area, and that's okay too. But that having a different set of experiences really rounds you out with your knowledge and your skills to help build a professional or a leadership portfolio. I had a job where one job I was in charge of technical services. So that was like all the processing and ordering and cataloging and all that. And I learned so much about that helped me later on in other jobs. And then I had a job where all I did was manage. It was a lot to manage, but I managed like the fiscal and the human resources and the facilities of an organization. And I hadn't really done that 100% before, and that was a great opportunity to learn some of those things. So I think it really helps if you're in a situation where you can try different jobs as you either stay in one organization or move around a little bit.
That's great.
The other thing I said, think carefully about the title of the job versus the scope of the job. So, as I said, when I was a library director of a little tiny library that had like 6 employees, and it was a great experience. I got huge experience in this job. It was great. But then when I went to be an assistant director, which I can remember somebody said, well, I wouldn't apply for an assistant director job. Well, I was an assistant director in an organization that had 10 branches. It had like 60 employees. It was just a much bigger organization. So, the title, don't worry about think about the scope and scale of the responsibility and what you're going to get out of it. And don't, as I said, some people are so worried about titles. I don't buy that. I look at the value you're going to get from the position.
I think that's also helpful with specific positions that a lot of these students are going to be looking at. In
Right.
these entry-level positions, I get students coming in asking if they're not prepared for it because they think the title's too far along and that wouldn't be something that they could do. But then when you actually look at the job description, you realize that they have the skills and they've already gained that experience through a lot of their DFWs and they're working on campus and all of that. So I think that that's a great little piece of advice to help students realize that you can do it. You can go for a job.
Thing about that point is that this can be really scary and, you know, kind of like, oh, do I want to do this? But, you know, if you look at a job and you think, well, I don't know that I'm totally qualified, but I'm going to give it a shot. So let's say you fill out the application, and that's an experience to do that. And maybe you don't get the interview. Maybe you do get an interview. Even if you don't get the job, going through the interview, you know, you get to know what that's like. It helps you react better the next time you have to do an interview. And then it's an organization where you meet people and you never know what's going to happen. I applied for a job. I wanted to move to California, and I was applying for jobs all over. In Northern California. I was applying for jobs, and I got an interview for a job. And I did pretty well in like the rankings, but I didn't get the job. Somebody else got the job. So a couple months later, somebody who was sitting on the panel from another library system called me up and said, hey, we have a job here. Do you want to apply for this job? We thought you were really good at the interview. So you never know what that interviewing is going to do and who you're going to meet and how it might result in something. So I know it's scary and it can be hard, but, you know, I don't know. Well, all they're going to say is no, and that's the worst thing. But you'll learn something from it.
Yeah,
and you won't know if you don't try.
Exactly. You are definitely saying a lot of things that I like to say and tell people too, because the no is really scary. You're absolutely right. Nobody likes to hear no. And I personally learned how to hear that when I worked at a telemarketing firm. So I think that's my biggest kind of helpful job that I've had in my past life was asking for money for fundraising and having most people tell you, no, thank you. I give other places. So learning how to become okay with no. I think the faster you can do that, the easier it will be as you continue and progress in your career so that you can find other opportunities. So speaking of, you were kind of talking a little bit about, you know, some resources before. And so I wonder if there's any resources you can pinpoint that you think would be helpful for students. As you know, the HBR articles are always great. You know, there's lots of places to read about becoming a leader, but I was wondering if you had any others that you know of.
The thing that I would, when you talk about resources, you kind of think about, oh, okay, is that like something to read or a website or something like that? And I would just say, you know, I mean, this sounds kind of trite, but I mean, the Wall Street Journal is really important. I don't read it every day, but I'll look at it sometimes for things. And another magazine that you might check out on cutting edge leadership is a Fast Company. That's really good. But two things I want to pitch. And one is that I think if you're really interested in leadership, ALA has an organization called the Center for the Future of Libraries. And you can sign up to be on their website. They get email, you know, you can get a list every week with all kinds of new trends, and they have blogs. I mean, it's just, it isn't so much particular leadership advice, but it keeps you on the cutting edge of what's happening, and that's where you need to be as a leader. The other thing I would say, and we haven't really talked about it during this discussion, but I think it really is helpful if in your organization, if you're working or if you're starting out in an organization, you identify someone who would serve as your coach or mentor. Because that can really make a difference. And look around, you know, say you're in an organization for a little while, a few months. I mean, look around and see who you really respect and see who you think is really doing a great job and creating new services and working well with his or her team, and identify that person and really see if you can develop that kind of a mentor-coach relationship. Now, some organizations have formal mentoring relationships, mentoring programs, and that's good. Sometimes it's more informal. Also, sometimes I've seen state associations have programs where they will, partner someone with a mentor, not necessarily from the same library system. And I mean, I guess the downside of the mentoring is that, it can get, you want to make sure the relationship and the parameters of the relationship are really clear. And the person really ultimately, hopefully, would be your advocate in terms of different jobs or promotions inside or outside the organization. But I think, identifying someone that you respect, that you think, I'd like to try to be working in a style or similar to that individual, and developing that relationship with that person, a mentor-protege relationship, can really make a difference.
I would love to create a mentorship program. I think that's something that the students are hoping to find. And I know that SLA does have a mentorship program. Special Library Association does do that. But theirs is the only one I've really heard of at this point. And so thinking about in the future, seeing where I'd like to see career services go in the future would be hopefully at some point being able to start a mentorship program. And it looks like Victoria.
So where would you see you'd get the mentors from?
Probably alumni, if we could.
Alumni. Oh, yeah. Wow, that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be awesome to have. I know that we can kind of facilitate some relationships with alumni for students. So if you, as a student, are looking for that type of relationship, I can definitely kind of work on helping connect you with those types of people, but we just don't have anything formalized at this point as well. But it looks like
that's
Victoria.
A really neat idea.
Yeah, Victoria said that the California Library Association has a mentorship program as well.
They used to. Do they still have one in California? Oh, yeah, CLA. Okay, great.
Yeah. And Courtney said that her school district does too.
Oh,
so.
And Courtney says her school district does. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. It's nice to hear that they are starting to put those in, I think, all different sorts of systems, places as school versus public libraries. I know that the University of Washington does have, the UW libraries do have some sort of experience like that as well. That's cool. Compensation associated.
The mentors get compensation. That's good.
Yeah, that you don't see that
that's
often.
Because Courtney works with a school district, and they have a union too, right? Courtney and I were talking about the union recently.
Interesting. That's actually something we never talked about, was like union impacting leadership and how that works. And I think that's probably a bigger topic for another day, but I know that can be a consideration for leaders as well, is how you interact with your employees, and then particularly having union different types of relationships as well. That's interesting. Does anyone have any questions out there? I know we've kind of got a little bit of participation, but I'd love to be able to answer questions that anybody else has. And if not, I'll just kind of move along to our last question that I have preset. And that's just wondering.
Here's one from Shannon.
Oh, good. Yeah.
You talk a lot about the importance of leaders having vision. What does the process of developing vision look like? Okay. So this is a very good question. So any of the students on here who've had me already know that all I talk about is strategic planning. That's all I talk about. And it's not the only thing, but the vision, developing a vision is something I think that you personally want to believe in for the institution that you're working for, but the vision is a vision that's developed and owned by you and your staff and the community. And I think developing that vision comes out of a very open and community-based and transparent strategic planning process. And that can happen at an organization. I mean, some organizations are required to do strategic plans every 3 years, 4 years. Other times a new administrator or leader will come in and do a strategic plan if one is kind of old or there isn't one in place. But I think when you talk about the vision, at least the vision for your institution, doing strategic planning can really make a difference. I think when I was talking about the Center for the Future of Libraries, I mean, I think in order to develop a vision that's community-based, you still want to be able to understand the trends and directions in the field and really bring that to your community. So you're doing some of the most innovative, impactful services and programs. So you need, I think, a mix of, you're always looking out at what's happening all around the field, but you're also deeply engaged with your community in developing a vision that's going to work for your organization.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Shannon. That was a great question. Susan, I'm wondering, do you have the students take a look at the iSchool strategic plan?
We didn't. In the last quarter, one of our students did do a kind of a deep dive in the iSchool strategic plan. I didn't require people to do that. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really interesting, and I think it'd be, if students are curious, I think it's something that's really interesting for them to learn about, and how the iSchool incorporates that as well, not only teaching it, but also using it in the day-to-day of the iSchool too.
Right.
Yeah. So it looks like we don't really have any other questions. So we'll just move on to my last question, and then hopefully there'll be a couple others. And if not, that's okay too. But I'm just wondering, so we're going to move back to personal, and just wondering how things that you do and how you ensure that you continue to grow and develop as a leader. Is there anything in particular that you do, or anything that you've thought about?
That is a really good question, because I'm like, whoa, wow. Well, I'm always reading. I'm always scanning. I scan the horizon a lot. So I think that keeps me refreshed. I also look at partnerships all the time. And now being a professor, it's a little bit different, but I look at opportunities to go in new directions and try to work on those. So that helps me expand, my knowledge base. I mean, there's so much going on right now with civic engagement, community engagement, social justice, racial equity, all those topics. And I'm really interested in those topics. And so I'm supposed to be teaching a special topics course next winter on community and civic engagement. And it's really exciting for me to try to figure out the landscape of that topic in our field. And I also seek out individuals that I think are strong leaders. Now, at my age, at this point, it's really mostly people that I see as really coming up in the field and making a difference. So, there's not that many people older than I am to follow. So, but I find people that I think, younger people, or people that are, mid-career or begin, wherever they are. I find people that I think are really leading leading our field, and I follow them. Some of the students may know this, I'm not sure if they do or not, but every year a professional journal, library journal, which is kind of the business industry standard of the library world, comes out with this list of individuals who've been identified as movers and shakers. And people are recommended for that, and then Library Journal selects them. And that's not necessarily, I know some of those folks. It's interesting. I usually look at that because I want to see the hot topics that they're working on, and also in some situations I know them, or I often will know the director of their institution. So I follow folks that way. So I'm really always looking for our new leaders and really trying to learn from them.
That's great. I love that you talked about finding other people to look to. I definitely ask our student leaders with my work with them to, in some of our sessions, to identify leaders that they have seen around, and to be able to think through that, because I think as I'll refer to myself as a newer professional, not completely new, but as a new professional as well, still kind of growing and shaping, that I try to do that to emulate. And I think there's a lot of really great leaders on the iSchool campus as well that we can look to, some of your colleagues, Susan. So it's really nice to be able to see that leadership in all parts of kind of your professional life, and ours, as well as students and colleagues at the iSchool. So yeah, so that's all the questions that I had for you.
Okay.
I'm hoping if there's a few more from online, but if there isn't, we can definitely wrap up because we're getting close to 7 o'clock now. So
Well, if folks are thinking, oh, here we go. At times, leadership is shared via co-directorships. Okay, how do you handle? Okay, that can be challenging. I shouldn't say. I'm wondering where she's from in California, but I don't mean to ask her to try to get too personal. But so this is an interesting situation. I think so much of what works in leadership depends on personality. So if you have a situation where for whatever reason you have co-directors, and the reason why I saw a situation like this play out a few years ago in a library in Northern California where it ultimately didn't work out very well. I think they meant to, and I don't know what Victoria's thinking about, but I think from an ideal perspective, from a theoretical perspective, it could work very well. In order for that to work, you have to have clearly defined roles, and you want to make sure you have individuals that have skills that complement each other. Because maybe you have somebody who's, really focused on budgeting and policies and politics, and then somebody else that cares much more about programs and services. If you're going to do that, you need to have individuals who are complementing each other. You need to have clear definition of roles, who's doing what, and also those individuals have to have, I'm assuming they're reporting to somebody, so that a city manager, or a university dean, whatever it is, they've got to have a person they're reporting to that's really willing to try to make that situation work. So it can be challenging. So here's another question. I'm part of a small association, a lot of good, but then they fizzle out. They're so small, yeah. So this is lots of visionaries, not enough implementers. Wow, that is tough. So when I was, this can be a challenge for leadership, because here you are saying that you have a lot of ideas, but kind of not enough capacity. People are not, you don't have the kind of the skill level, or the type of skill isn't, that isn't exactly meshed with what you have going on. And I would say not to be not positive in responding to you, Jenna, but what is the position of your CEO or your director, whoever is managing this small association? Because sometimes when you're in a small group like that, if you have too many people who are thinking about what we want to do, but not enough people to make it happen, somebody's got to say, hey, we just have to figure out a couple of things we're going to do really well and some things we're not going to do. Or maybe create a timeline for things that we can do in the short term and things we do in the long term. And oftentimes organizations will look at that and say, well, what's the low-hanging fruit that we can do without a lot of effort and make a big difference, and then gear up for doing some things that might take more work or be longer. But I would also ask, is there a board or some other kind of an entity that is providing oversight to this association? Because they may need to have some level of involvement. But what I was going to say, Alicia, is you can make sure everybody has my email, because if we want, we could talk offline about some of these situations. But Jenna's, that could be a tough one, because the person who's in charge has to be able to step back and say, wow, maybe we're just trying to do too much. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had a leadership fail? Okay, have I had a leadership fail? What happened? Well, I haven't had, okay, I wouldn't say I've had my tenure as a leader not be successful, but there was a couple things that I would just refer to real quickly, situations that happened at the San Francisco Public Library, a place like no other. And two situations, but one situation, we wanted to try to use a collection development agency to go after individuals who hadn't brought back materials or had huge fines. And although this was a fairly ordinary process, in most libraries in San Francisco, it just got really like overblown, and it became really a challenge between, and this was really hard, between the the paraprofessionals who worked on the desk every day and had to explain why the books weren't there or what I mean, you know, who knew some of the challenges of borrowers who weren't, you know, respecting the rules, and the librarians, but particularly in this case, the librarians, the leaders of the union, went out against this because they said it was contracting out work to a collection agency. And this became a very emotional issue, which divided the staff, which is highly unfortunate. And I'll never forget it, that this particular policy went before a governing body, the Board of Supervisors, and I had paraprofessionals coming to testify to the Board of Supervisors and the librarians, like on opposite sides. And unfortunately, we had one supervisor who said he was going to vote with the paraprofessionals, and then when we got there, he changed. And so they never got the collection development agency. And, you know, I looked at it in this way. I think I did the right thing to bring it forward. And I was so proud of the paraprofessionals who stood up there and just really wanted it. But hey, you know, it didn't fly. So for me, we had another huge controversy in San Francisco over implementing RFID as a method of checking out materials, and we never could get it through. And now it's interesting because they're trying again in San Francisco to get RFID tags in all the books, and I don't know what's going to happen. But sometimes you do things because, you know, you feel like it's the right thing to do, and maybe it doesn't come out that way, but you feel like, hey, it's something. I felt in both those cases it was something I had to do, and I learned a lot. It didn't work out, but anyway, I felt I didn't regret doing it because I thought it was something we had to try. I kind of regretted the outcome, but I didn't regret trying it.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting about the RFID tags. It seems like something that can be so easily, or at least like I went through that when I was working at the library system in Phoenix. They started doing RFID tags right when I was working there, and it seems so commonplace now, but it's interesting to see that it isn't, and there's a lot of people that still.
When we tried it in San Francisco, it was maybe in the early 2000s. And there were still people that were concerned about privacy of information and being able to read what was on the tag. And so people would know what you were reading, even though most of this has proven not to be accurate. San Francisco is a unique place. So anyway, it's a long story. I should write a little novel about what happened with that. But anyway, hopefully they'll get it now. They're trying again, God bless them, and hopefully they'll get it.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up now since we're at 7:06. So thank you so much, Susan, for your time tonight. It was a great conversation.
Well, if anybody wants to keep talking, it's Hildreth at uw.edu. So just send me an email and we can talk more. Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
All
Have
right.
a wonderful night. Bye.
Yeah.